It's all true. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the man who led the Dachau Massacre, and when I say led the Dachau Massacre, I mean everyone involved got so lucky that this was the soldier who just so happened to be assigned the task of liberating the first ever Nazi concentration camp. 70% of this video is about what happened at Dachau, but to understand why he acted the way he did April 29, 1945, you'd have to know what happened leading up to it. Felix Sparks was born August 2nd, 1917, in a remote mining town about 80 miles east of Phoenix, Arizona. He had one younger brother and sister, and when he was a kid, he went hiking, hunting, fishing, and played baseball because that's pretty much all there was to do. The only real discrimination he saw as a kid was against Mexicans. There were only 3 black families in his town, and their kids were segregated into a one-room schoolhouse. There were 0 Jews in his town and 0 Jews in his high school. When he was in high school, he decided that what he really wanted to do was be a lawyer. But his parents had no money, so he didn't have a chance of going to college. So after high school, in 1936, he enlisted in the U.S. Army to make money to pay for college. He signed up for 3 years of active duty, followed by a few years in the reserves. He found out that if he volunteered for foreign service, he could knock 6 months off this active duty time. At that time, Hawaii counted as foreign service, and he volunteered to go there. He got assigned to work coastal defense at Pearl Harbor, rising to the rank of sergeant. He stayed in Hawaii for the next few years. When he got out, he enrolled at the University of Arizona to first get his degree, and then he could start applying to law schools. He married his high school sweetheart, and everything was going according to his plan until one day something happened that neither Felix nor his wife ever thought would happen. He got recalled to active duty by the Army for 1 year. By 1940, Europe was at war, and the United States was finally expanding their military. Being as Felix now had a college education, he was sent to officer training school, and in January 1941, he was assigned 1 year of active duty, where he'd be training new recruits. He was assigned to the 45th Division, and perhaps ironically, the symbol of the 45th Division that they had on their shoulder patch as an insignia was a swastika, in honor of the Arizona indigenous, the Anasazi. But due to the Nazis, they changed their insignia from an indigenous swastika to an indigenous thunderbird. Getting called up put a stop to his plans, but he took it in stride. It was only for 1 year, and he figured he'd be able to put quite a bit of money aside. The year went by quickly, but then, just 1 month before he was scheduled to be sent home, Pearl Harbor happens. Now nobody is going home, everybody is going to war. From this point on, things begin to happen fast. The 45th Division gets relocated to Oklahoma, but they don't spend much time there. Being a division that's already mobilized, they're going to be among the first American divisions sent overseas. They got sent to upstate New York for winter warfare training, then to coastal Massachusetts for amphibious warfare training. Luckily for Lieutenant Sparks, wives could come with all throughout this training, and his wife is 8.5 months pregnant when his division gets sent to Norfolk, Virginia, where they had to wait a few weeks for a convoy of ships to form up, and then all sail across the Atlantic together. It was like a Hollywood movie. The very day his wife goes into labor is the day he ships out for North Africa. Just before the ship sails, he got handed a telegram saying Mom and the baby are both healthy, and he'll get to meet his son Kirk when he gets home. A week or two later, they arrive in North Africa, just at the tail end of Patton's infamous battle with Rommel. His division began training immediately because they were going to be among the first waves in the invasion of Sicily. By this point, he was a captain, and he was in charge of his own company when the invasion of Sicily began, July 9, 1943. Captain Sparks saw plenty of frontline combat, and during this invasion, the Allies suffered almost 6,000 killed and more than 15,000 wounded. By mid-August, the battle was all but over, and planning began for the invasion of mainland Italy. He was in charge of 200 men when the invasion of Italy began, January 22, 1944, landing at Anzio. This battle turned into a brutal battle of attrition. He would be awarded the Purple Heart and a Silver Star for valor in combat while in Italy. He would go on to get one more of each of these medals later in the war. The Nazis savagely defended what became known as the Gustav Line, and by May of 1944, only 2 of Captain Sparks' original 200 men were still fighting, him and one other sergeant. 198 of the original 200 were killed, wounded, or captured. Finally, by June 4th, 1944, Rome had been captured, and the Anzio campaign was over. By the time of D-Day, 2 days later, he had already been in combat for 10 consecutive months, and now his division was selected for the second D-Day, the invasion of southern France, to begin in less than 60 days. He was promoted to major and made battalion commander. He was now in charge of 1,000 men. D-Day was August 15th, 1944. And planners feared casualties would be just as severe during the invasion of southern France as they were in northern France 2 months ago. Major Sparks and every other battalion commander was set to go in with the second wave at D+10, 10 minutes after the first wave, to make sure things didn't devolve into chaos on the beaches. They expected 20% casualties, but luckily only suffered less than 5%. The Nazis withdrew to better defensive positions within Vichy, France, while the Americans occupied Marseille, Toulon, Saint-Tropez, and the entirety of the French Riviera. A month later, the 7th Army linked up with the 3rd Army of General Patton, and Colonel Sparks and his battalion was then ordered to proceed into the Vosges Mountains. This is where the Nazis had set up a defensive line. Today, in 2023, the Vosges are known for several famous mid-level Tour de France climbs, including the Grand Ballon, the Ballon d'Alsace, and the Planche de Belfi. But in the late fall, early winter of 1944, it was ruthless, brutal combat. They would fight and kill and die and suffer major casualties to take a mountain. They'd get to the top of it, only to see another mountain that looked exactly like the one they just climbed. And this went on over and over and over again for dozens upon dozens of mountains and 75 consecutive miles over 3 straight months. It was ruthless and psychological hell because it looked like they were accomplishing nothing. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel due to the remarkable job he was doing. And by the middle of December, some of the forward units of his battalion had crossed into Nazi Germany. But on December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge began with a massive Nazi counterattack in the Ardennes region. This is when General Patton made his famous 2-day swing with the 3rd Army to go and relieve Bastogne. This meant that the holes left by Patton had to be filled by the 7th Army, so Colonel Sparks had to pull his men back and set up a new defensive line. Then on December 31st, 1944, Operation Nordwind happened, when 50,000 Nazis came pouring through the American lines in a counteroffensive against the 7th Army to hopefully draw away forces from the main attack up north. Colonel Sparks' battalion had to hold the line against 5,000 Nazis, and they took devastating casualties doing it over the next 3 weeks. But by February 1944, it was over. Out of his 1,000 original men on D-Day, 800 of them had been killed, wounded, or captured. And it must have weighed heavily on him, losing so many men and seeing so many dead bodies. These were men he knew. They were his men. Between Anzio and southern France, 83% of his men became casualties. The reason for this was not because he was a bad leader or didn't know what the hell he was doing. On the contrary, he was an exceptional leader, one of the best, and his superiors gave him extraordinarily difficult assignments, knowing there would be high casualties because they knew he could handle it. And he did handle it. By the early spring of 1945, they had re-entered Nazi Germany, crossing the Rhine River on pontoon bridges. In his personal photo collection, Felix Sparks has a picture of General George S. Patton taking a piss into the Rhine River while facing the camera. Amazingly, as they advanced into Bavaria, the homeland of Nazism, they did not meet as much resistance in many towns as they had anticipated. Apparently, by this point in the war, they were pretty fucking sick and tired of the Nazis. Of course, there were still fanatical SS troops who vowed to fight to the death, and the Battle of Aschaffenburg was one such instance. And for over a week, Colonel Sparks and his men fought in this city with many other American units. And total losses were 3,000 for the Americans and over 5,000 for the Nazis in a week. Colonel Sparks was also there for the Battle of Nuremberg, which actually fell quicker than Aschaffenburg did. By mid-April 1945, their final goal of capturing Munich seemed to be no more than a few days away. It took about 2 weeks, but the city of Munich was going to fall. But then one morning, April 29, 1945, Colonel Sparks gets an emergency message from division headquarters telling him to stop what he is doing and immediately proceed to a Nazi military camp known as Dachau, with explicit orders not to allow anyone into the camp or out once it has been secured. This pissed him off a little because to him it seemed like some pointless mopping up assignment that was taking away from the ultimate objective of reaching Munich. At the same time, he's a bit relieved because it's a mopping up assignment, so hopefully nobody would be killed from this particular company anyways. I Company. The only other companies he had in the area were L and K companies, and they were both engaged in combat. So I Company, the Reserve Company, the mopping up company got the call. And not one of them was prepared for the sadistic, inhumane nightmare that they were about to walk into. In addition to I Company, Colonel Sparks also attaches a light machine gun platoon from M Company, and together they head towards the camp a few miles away. Colonel Sparks has his personal rifleman with him as a bodyguard, and also his interpreter. His terp was a 19-year-old kid named Karl Mann. This kid came to the U.S. barely 10 years ago because his father, who was a university professor in Bavaria, despised the Nazis and spoke out against them every chance he got. Had they chosen to stay in Germany, then Dachau is the place his father likely would have ended up for spreading dissent and misinformation about the Nazis. It was late morning when they reached the outer perimeter of the camp. Now, this had an 8-foot-tall concrete walls going all the way around it, and it looked not much different than many of the other Nazi military camps they'd seen before. But this camp was very, very different. Colonel Sparks decided against entering through the main gate, fearing they could be walking right into a trap as the main gate was likely to be heavily defended. As such, he ordered his men to follow a railroad spur which went up the side of the camp. Now, Dachau was huge, and each side of these outer walls was like a mile long, and they followed these railroad tracks for like 10 or 15 minutes when they saw a few rail cars up ahead in the distance. As they got closer, they realized that there were about 40 or 50 of these wooden rail cars. As they approached the first few cars, they noticed that there was a handful of people lying on the ground just outside of the cars. All of them were emaciated and looked like they were starved nearly to death. And all of them on the ground outside the railroad cars seemed to have had their heads bashed in by the butt of a rifle. This fucked with the Americans seeing this. Then they began to open the train cars, and inside every single one of these train cars was hundreds of emaciated dead bodies. For 10 or 15 minutes, the U.S. troops investigated inside these rail cars, all of them stunned and shocked into complete silence. And then the anger began to set in. Some of the troops started freaking out. A low-ranking private would look to his sergeant saying, "What the fuck is this, Sarge? What the fuck is going on here?" The sergeant would look to Colonel Sparks as if to say, "What the fuck is this, Colonel? Why would they do this? These are civilians." But Colonel Sparks had no answers. Some of the men started crying. Others were puking all over the place from the fucked up sights and smells they were witnessing. And many others became very, very enraged and were ready to kill with transfixed dazes in their eyes. They thought there was about to be a battle ahead. They thought they had to fight the troops inside this camp. So they prepared to enter the camp right there on the spot. The tone for this upcoming battle was set. But as they started crossing over into this camp, Lieutenant Colonel Sparks ordered a lieutenant to take 5 men and patrol the perimeter on the outside of this camp to see if there's any Nazi guards or traps out there. Now, the first thing Colonel Sparks saw upon entering this camp was a neighborhood of very nice middle-class German houses. They quickly figured out that these were the officers' houses, and inside each home they went in, there was evidence that whoever lived there packed up and left in a hurry. Over the next half hour, they pushed deeper into the camp, and occasionally they'd find guards who'd quickly surrender. And as they searched building after building, they'd find wounded and healthy Wehrmacht soldiers and begin putting all the POWs together into an open coal yard. They weren't meeting much resistance, but on more than one occasion, Colonel Sparks hears the sound of small arms fire in the distance. He doesn't yet know it, but about this time, there's another very small unit of American troops that has entered a different area of this camp, without permission from anyone. Also back outside the wall, the half-dozen men he ordered to secure the perimeter have captured themselves 4 Nazi guards. They've also counted over 2,000 dead bodies in the 40 or so train cars. And the Americans are fucking enraged, and they order all 4 of these Nazis to climb inside one of the train cars and force them to stare at all the dead bodies. Then all 4 of the Nazis are shot. If nothing else, at least these 4 Nazis knew why they were murdered. The millions upon millions of concentration camp victims had no idea why any of this was happening. But at least these 4 Nazis got that. And after all 4 of them were shot, another American climbed into the train car and shot each one of them in the head again, just to make sure. This group then scales the wall to join the rest of the Americans inside the camp. As Colonel Sparks is talking to his men and telling which guys to search which buildings, they all go silent because they think they hear the sound of an American voice screaming in the distance, loudly, saying things like, "Get back here, you fucking Nazi scumbag, I'll fucking kill you, get the fuck back here." Then they see an SS guard appear from around the side of a building running at a full trot, with an American chasing him, holding a pistol in his hand like he's ready to pistol whip the shit out of him. It takes 4 or 5 Americans to grab this guy and calm him down, while a few of the other guys grab the Nazi and bring him to the coal yard with the rest of the 30 or so POWs they've collected so far. At one point, they find a Polish inmate who speaks German, and Colonel Sparks has his interpreter talk to him, and he has him stay with them for whenever they have a question about something inside the camp. Aside from finding a handful of capos, they haven't even found the inmates area yet, the victims area, so that he continues having the men press deeper into the camp. What happens next happened very fast and came with virtually no warning at all. There were about a dozen Americans milling about in the area, as well as 30 or so German prisoners who weren't going anywhere, as there's one of the light machine guns was on the ground pointed right at them. Colonel Sparks is giving out orders to some of his guys when a lieutenant comes up to him and says, "Hey, Colonel, we found something that I think you need to come take a look at." Colonel Sparks is very busy at this moment, so he asks why. He says, "What's so important that I have to come see?" The lieutenant says, "I don't even know, Colonel. I don't even know. You have to come see this." The colonel agrees to go with him. But as all these different things are going on at once, nobody even notices that the private manning the machine gun is on the verge of a mental fucking breakdown. The things he saw inside these train cars was more than he could take, and he starts screaming out, "They're trying to escape, they're trying to escape," and he opens up with the machine gun. Colonel Sparks had just turned to leave to go check out what the lieutenant wanted him to see, when all of a sudden he hears the gunfire. He stops, turns around, pulls out his pistol, and fires it into the air, shouting, "Cease fire." But nobody can hear him over the gunfire, so he runs up behind the private on the machine gun and kicks him in the back. He then grabs him and yanks him up to his feet and asks him what the hell he's doing. This private is hysterical. He's crying his eyes out, saying, "They were trying to escape, Colonel. They were trying to escape." Obviously, the colonel doesn't believe this, and he pushes him aside to a sergeant and orders an NCO to man the machine gun. He then ordered his troops to go take a look at the Germans. Between 20 and 25 shots were fired, and 12 of these Nazis were killed, with a few other ones injured. After the situation is back under control, he agrees to go with his lieutenant to go look at and see what he wanted them to see. But first, he pulls out his pistol again. He fires a single shot into the air and says no one is to shoot anyone else for any reason without permission from him first. He then follows his lieutenant, and a minute or two later, he's walking past a pile of 100 naked, starved, dead human beings, all stacked on top of each other like cordwood. And there's like 5 or 6 of these piles next to each other. They then come to a room with several giant ovens inside. It's a crematorium. The ovens were all cold, meaning they'd all been off for at least 24 hours, because the Nazis ran out of coal and couldn't burn the rest of the piled up victims or the thousands of other victims still on the train. They didn't stop because the war was almost over or because the Americans were getting close. They stopped only because they ran out of coal. After this, Colonel Sparks pushed farther into the camp, and they got to the inner wall, the inner perimeter where the concentration camp victims were being held. Except this wall had guard towers going all the way around its entire perimeter every few hundred yards. He walked over to the tower that was nearest the gate for the inner entrance to this camp, and he saw 5 dead Nazis laying on the ground in front of this tower. It was at this moment that he knew with 100% certainty that his men had killed these Nazis, and this was the small arms fire that he heard earlier. He did not yet know that there were other Americans inside the camp, and it was these other Americans that killed these 5 Nazis. He turns away and goes to get some of his other guys, and together they all enter this main prison area. Now, this area is enormous. There's about 30 giant barracks buildings that look like they can fit 200 people each, and word quickly spreads among the victims that the Americans have arrived. Even though the people are starving and weak and emaciated, they start pouring out of these barracks. And they're counting 1,000 people coming out of these barracks, even though each one of these buildings is only designed to hold 200 people. The indescribable emotional howls and screams, it was audible everywhere. And as the U.S. troops began investigating this area, they were even more psychologically damaged and fucked up at any previous point, because there was dead bodies everywhere, and all of these surviving victims were emaciated to the point that it looked like none of them weighed over 100 pounds. Suddenly, groups of people start murdering individuals, violently murdering them, beating them to death with their bare hands. And this is going on in 6 or 7 places out in the distance. Colonel Sparks is shocked by this and has no idea why it's happening, so he asks his interpreter to ask the Polish inmate what the hell is going on here. The Polish inmate tells them that what they are doing is they are killing the capos, the rats, the informers, the collaborators. And Colonel Sparks may or may not realize the magnitude of the task they have ahead of them, but he orders a few of his medics to go check inside the barracks, see if there's people who are too weak to come back outside, and sends a dozen or so other men to go search every Nazi official building for food and drinkable water. He also has to tell these victims that none of them can leave the camp yet. They were in the middle of an active combat zone, and they couldn't turn loose 30,000 people into the surrounding countryside. Every once in a while, they would spot someone in the concentration camp uniform who weighed like 180 or 200 pounds. These were Nazis trying to blend in with the others. Other Nazis would be caught in civilian worker clothes, trying to evade capture. According to historical records, between 35 and 50 Nazis were executed during the Dachau liberation reprisals. 12 of them came when the private on the light machine gun lost his mind and had a mental breakdown. 4 of them were executed inside the train car. 5 of them were found dead outside one of the towers from the other group of Americans. So this is where 21 of these deaths come from. The others came from fucked up instances when Colonel Sparks wasn't around and they thought they could get away with it. There were cases deep inside the camp where U.S. troops would find an SS guard and ask the people if he was innocent or guilty. If the victim said guilty, then the Nazi was summarily executed on the spot. Other instances include Americans coming across a dog kennel where there's 20-something dogs who were all trained to kill. So all of these dogs were immediately shot. But not far from this kennel was a barn, and a particularly sadistic and evil Nazi guard was caught hiding in this barn with civilian clothes. The inmates immediately recognized him as one of the most brutal and ruthless fucking guards in there, and they beat him to death with their bare hands, with rakes, and with other gardening tools. This Nazi guard was smashed in the face over 100 times by the victims until the mush of his remaining head was finally decapitated. These are where the other 15 or 20 Nazi executions came from. The U.S. troops, who were a reserve company and saw far less combat than most, were so psychologically traumatized by what they were witnessing that they didn't even interfere with any of the camp victims taking revenge on the Nazi guards. Colonel Sparks had to leave the camp because his radio was back outside of the Jeep that he drove in with outside the wall. He reported to headquarters that the situation was much worse than anything they could have imagined and requested field hospitals and field kitchens to be brought to the camp. When he went back inside, he was stopped by a few of the capos, who were outside the inner perimeter and therefore weren't murdered like the other ones were inside. These capos showed Colonel Sparks where the medical experiments were done, including the fucked up ones where they murdered people in ice water baths and put them inside pressure chambers to see what pressure they'd fucking explode at. Then they brought him into, not to mention all the hooks they had for hanging, whichever. Then they get inside to another area where there's blood stains all over the ground. The day before all of the high-ranking Nazis left, they executed a dozen or so German officers in full Wehrmacht uniforms. It was later learned that these executions were Germans who were implicated in the July 20th Stauffenberg plot to assassinate Hitler. Just as thousands of other Germans were, yeah. Colonel Sparks went back into the inmate victim area to let his guys know what was going on, and to have the victims told that medical attention would soon be arriving. By this point, it was late afternoon. It had been a very long and trying day. He allowed some of the enlisted guys to drink some of the booze they found in some of the Nazis' officers' buildings. These guys were expecting a mop-up assignment, and instead they just endured one of the most horrifying, traumatic, fucked-up experiences any of them had ever suffered. Suddenly, at a distance of a few hundred yards away, just outside the outer of the 2 gates coming from the direction of the main entrance to the camp, 2 American jeeps appear. And they come to a stop just outside the gate. Now, Colonel Sparks and his men left their jeeps outside by the rail cars, where they scaled the wall several hours earlier. So he had no clue who these Americans were, and neither did anybody else. Colonel Sparks took 3 or 4 of his guys and opened the gates and went outside to greet these Americans. Following behind them were several hundred camp victims who were following behind just to see what was going on, basically. And they all lined up against at the side of the fence. They got outside the gate and closed it behind him, and Colonel Sparks was now close enough to see that this was a general. He had a beautiful woman in her 20s riding with him, which was confusing. She was Marguerite Higgins, a reporter, and the other jeep was 2 colonels, who were the general's assistants. Unbeknownst to Colonel Sparks, General Linden and about a dozen of his men had arrived at the main entrance of the camp not long after Colonel Sparks and his men started following the railroad tracks up the side. General Linden accepted the official surrender of the camp from an alleged Red Cross representative who claimed to have convinced the Nazi lieutenant left in charge to peaceably surrender the camp. After some of General Linden's men saw the conditions inside the camp, and likely killed the 5 guards at the guard tower, General Linden smacked the shit out of this Nazi with his swagger stick, which was like this leather-type whip that he carried with him. This commanding Nazi was likely murdered by the Americans, but either way, the camp officially surrendered to General Linden. General Linden sat in his jeep as Colonel Sparks introduced himself and asked what the general was doing there. The general replied that Miss Higgins wanted to do an interview with a few of the camp victims. She got out of the jeep and went over to the fence where the inmates were to see if any of them spoke English. But Colonel Sparks had to tell the general, he told the general no. He said, "Sorry, General, but my orders are specific. I'm not allowed to let anyone in or out of this camp." The general gets out of his jeep and says, "Don't worry about it. I'll take responsibility for it." But Colonel Sparks still refuses. He says, "Sorry, General, I can't allow it." The general doesn't reply. Instead, he gets out his swagger stick and smacks one of Sparks' men who was holding a bottle of booze, yelling at him to put that bottle down. Seeing his man hit, it fucking pisses him off. But Colonel Sparks doesn't do anything about it. Yet. General Linden then tells Colonel Sparks that, "Hey, I outrank you, I'm the general here, I say what goes, I say she can go inside," while pointing his swagger stick at him. Colonel Sparks says, "General, you are operating outside of your jurisdiction. This battle area is the responsibility of the 45th Division, not the 42nd Division. You are operating outside of your zone, and you have no authority here. I do, and my orders are specific. No one comes in or out." All of the U.S. soldiers were watching this argument, and nobody was paying attention to the fact that Maggie Higgins decided to open the gate and try to go inside to talk to some people. She was immediately surrounded and rushed and overwhelmed by the hundreds of camp victims who had gathered at the gate and now were pushing their way out right past her. The U.S. troops of both General Linden and Colonel Sparks fired their guns into the air to try to get the situation back under control and get these people back inside the camp. After a few minutes, they finally did, but Colonel Sparks was pissed. He had one of his men escort Maggie Higgins back to the jeep, and then he told a nearby private now, to go escort General Linden back to the gate to the main entrance to get the rest of his men and out of the camp. Now imagine being a private and getting this order to escort a general somewhere, anywhere. So this very nervous private approaches the general and is about to tell him to leave, but General Linden doesn't even give him a chance to talk. He smacks him in his head with his swagger stick, basically tells him to fuck off. Now this about snapped Colonel Sparks. As soon as he sees this guy hit, again, he pulls out his pistol. He pulls out his gun, he walks right up to the general, he levels his gun at his head, and says, "If you touch one more of my men, I'll kill you myself." This fucking dumbfounds everybody, including the camp victims who are witnessing this strange fight between the Americans, even though they can't speak English. A colonel on the jeep behind General Linden, who also outranks Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, gets out of the jeep and says, "Hey, you can't talk to my general that way. You better watch yourself, buddy. I'm going to see you after the war," implying he's going to come find him and fight him after the war. Now, this partially diffuses the situation because Colonel Sparks lowers his gun, but he yells at this other colonel and said, "After the war, what's wrong with right now?" General Linden does not let his guy reply. He tells the colonel to get back in his jeep. General Linden then threatens Colonel Sparks with a court-martial, which he's going to file a report on as soon as he gets back to his base. Colonel Sparks says, "Okay, that's fine, we'll leave, but I'm filing a court-martial on you." And Colonel Sparks says, "That's fine, just do it from your own zone." The general then leads the way out of the camp with the other jeep behind him. They meet up with the other guys from the 42nd Division, and they all leave the camp. As soon as General Linden gets back to his headquarters, he starts the court-martial process to get Colonel Sparks arrested. Colonel Sparks, meanwhile, goes back to doing his job, to securing the camp. A few hours later, it's nighttime, when the medics in the field kitchens finally begin to arrive for these people. Now, despite the fact that help arrived, between 50 and 75 people would die every day for more than a week after this camp is liberated. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Colonel Sparks' commanding officer, General Frederick, has gotten word that there was some sort of incident during the liberation of this camp. And General Linden is trying to have Colonel Sparks court-martialed. General Frederick wants to hear this story for himself, so he drives up to Dachau in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, and for the very first time of what will become hundreds of times over the rest of his life, Felix Sparks tells the story of what happened at Dachau. General Frederick has known Colonel Sparks for some time and believes every word he says. He tells the colonel not to worry about it, get some rest, you're going to be relieved during the day. Colonel Sparks only gets about 2 hours of sleep that night, but his guys are relieved the next day. But as the U.S. keeps advancing further into Germany, they've been finding all these other Dachau subcamps. So his men get sent to another one of these subcamps, and the day after that, they get sent back to Dachau. And all throughout this, they went to the town of Dachau to get the citizens to put them to work burying all the bodies and showing them what the fuck was going on inside these camps. Colonel Sparks is frustrated with this entire situation because it's been 3 straight days of not fighting and killing Nazis. But a few days later, finally, Nazi Germany surrendered and the war in Europe is over. By this point, the Dachau investigation, the official Dachau investigation, is underway, and there are rumors that some of his guys are going to be charged with war crimes. Now, this devastates Colonel Sparks, because he did everything he could do to prevent his guys from committing war crimes. A few days later, he gets called into division headquarters because General Frederick wants to talk to him. It is here that he finds out for the first time that troops from the 42nd Division were actually inside that camp before him, as they are also being investigated for war crimes. Until this point, he had no clue that General Linden's men had been that far inside the camp. He thought it was the first time that he saw them when they pulled up in the Jeep. He also finds out for sure that some of his guys are being investigated for war crimes, but the investigation into him personally has already been dismissed after a half-dozen troops testified that he was the one who kicked the shooter off of the machine gun. The court-martial, however, is a problem. General Linden refuses to back down on this. And this court-martial means that Colonel Sparks could be arrested and court-martialed at any time. It was at this point that General Frederick said, the 45th Division is getting sent to Japan. It's going to take about a month before everything gets turned around here and they leave Europe. So he orders Colonel Sparks home, back to the United States, right now, right at this meeting, immediately. He decides on 2 guys to guard the colonel for this, for the foreseeable future. General Frederick orders that both of these guards will be armed and authorizes them to have rifles with them when they leave. And he orders Colonel Sparks back to the U.S. right away. They leave in a Jeep. They have to drive 600 miles to Le Havre, France, where the troop ships back to the U.S. are. About 24 hours later, they make it to the port, and he's trying to check in on a transport ship, but by this point, his name is on a list. And the staff at the troop ships secretly notify the military police, and 2 MPs show up to take Colonel Sparks into custody. They threaten Colonel Sparks, and they say they have to take him into custody, and they're going to bring him to Bavaria immediately. But the 2 guys with Colonel Sparks, this must have been very, very fucked up to see this happen. The 2 guys with Colonel Sparks raise their rifles at the MP and say, you are not arresting him. You are not taking him anywhere. This is a very tense situation for the very, very stunned MPs who now have 2 combat veterans pointing assault rifles at him. But the situation is diffused when Colonel Sparks says he'll go back on his own. The young MP lieutenant asks for the colonel's word that he'll report directly to General Patton's headquarters in Bavaria. Colonel Sparks gives it, and they leave, headed the 600 miles back to Bavaria. But on the way back, they stop in Paris and get shit-faced drunk for 2 straight nights. The day after they leave Paris, they're back in Bavaria, and Colonel Sparks reports to Patton's headquarters. He's told that the general isn't in right now, and to go find some place go find a barracks and go get some sleep, report back at 0900. He tries to get some sleep that night, and at 0900 he reports to the headquarters again. But he's told this time that the general is busy and to report back sometime after lunch, so he leaves again and goes and does whatever for a few hours, and he reports back at 1300 hours. This time he's told the general will see you in a few moments, please have a seat. 25 minutes later, he's told to enter Patton's office. He stands before the general, who is sitting in silence looking at the court-martial from General Linden, as well as Colonel Sparks' entire military record dating back to 1936, which General Patton then starts reading aloud. From his time in Hawaii to his recall to active duty, to getting shipped to North Africa and the invasion of Sicily, and Patton only stops to ask one question. He says, so you served under me in Sicily, son? And Colonel Sparks shakes his head yes, and General Patton goes back to reading about all his time in southern France and Nazi Germany and being awarded Silver Stars and Purple Hearts, and yeah. At this point, Patton picks up the court-martial folder and says he doesn't see anything in here to get all worked up about, and he drops it in a trash can right in front of him. He then tells Colonel Sparks to head on back to his unit, and with that, the matter is officially closed. The war came to an end before the 45th Division got sent to the Pacific, and Lieutenant Colonel Sparks resigned his commission, and for the first time he got since he got called up for 1 year back in 1940, he finally went home to Arizona and got to meet his almost 3-year-old son. He then continued with his original plan to become a lawyer, and his family settled in Delta County, Colorado, where he opened a law firm with 2 other partners. Later in his career, he served as an interim justice on the Colorado Supreme Court, and also served on the Colorado Water Commission for the whole Colorado River Project thing there. He joined the Colorado National Guard and rose to the rank of general, but the only active military duty he saw after World War II happened nearly 20 years later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For anyone who's ever seen the movie 13 Days, when they're talking about U.S. troops being deployed all over the Southeast, Felix Sparks was among them. Had the United States invaded Cuba, he would have been there. But thankfully, cooler heads prevailed before World War III started. Now, ever since the liberation of Dachau, there's always been a bit of a debate, and sometimes a heated debate, between the 45th Division of Colonel Sparks and the 42nd Division of General Linden as to who liberated Dachau. The obvious answer seems like the 42nd Division of General Linden forced the camp's official surrender, while the 45th Division of Colonel Sparks was inside the camp liberating it. As a side note on General Linden, his drive to Dachau that day was nothing short of fucking crazy. There were a few dozen Nazis who found out that the war is over because of him, because of General Linden. He had to drive like 15 or something miles, the camp was way outside of his zone, through an active combat area to get to Dachau. Now, the Nazis he drove past were stunned and shocked into near paralysis when they saw the license plate of an American general coming down the road, with a general driving and a hot young woman in her 20s in the passenger seat. The Americans didn't even slow down, and the fucking Germans were too stunned to shoot. Marguerite Higgins was a trailblazing journalist who was doing her job. And she wrote a book about the liberation of Dachau, told from the perspective of what she interpreted was happening. In the book, she thought she was witnessing the surrender of one general to another, but being a civilian who was 25 years old, she didn't know it was a lieutenant who got left behind after all the high-ranking officers fled, who actually surrendered to General Linden. And this lieutenant turned out to be they later found that he was a particularly sadistic, fucking ruthless Nazi who killed many innocent people and led death marches, 3 or 4 death marches in which hundreds of people were killed. Nobody, including Marguerite Higgins, ever mentioned what happened to this final commandant of Dachau. History just records that he was killed that day. Now, Felix Sparks has had a few books written about him, and his life was defined by how he conducted himself on this one day when he was 27 years old. Of these books, one of them has the simplest, telling, and most fitting title, The Liberator, which is exactly who Felix Sparks was.